afternoon and thanks for joining us. I'm Judy Simpson. It ended 155 years ago this week. It was July 1863 in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. The Battle of Gettysburg was the deadliest battle of the Civil War, and by all accounts it was one of the most important for the Union Army and President Abraham Lincoln. When the battle was over, nearly 8,000 Americans had lost their lives and more than 50,000 were wounded. Those who died were memorialized in the National Cemetery at Gettysburg, which became the backdrop for one of the most famous speeches in American history. From Gettysburg, we learn more from historian Howard Coffin and Across the Fence associate producer Keith Silva.
The Battle of Gettysburg produced more than 50,000 casualties. The houses, the churches, all the buildings in Gettysburg seemed to be filled with them. To care for the wounded, the Union Army brought Major Henry James, an experienced surgeon, to oversee their care, and he came from Waterbury, Vermont. But what to do with the dead? The dead were everywhere. They lay on the slope of Little Round Top, where Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain had launched his bayonet charge to save the Union line on the second day. They were all over Plum Run Valley, which suddenly gained the name the Valley of Death. They were in Devil's Den among the boulders and the rocks. They were all over the wheat field, where long lines of battle had stood at almost point-blank range on a hot July afternoon and slaughtered each other. The dead were everywhere. The Confederates were hastily buried in mass graves, but what about the Union soldiers? They were placed in individual graves, and most of their graves were marked with rude headboards. But what to do overall? The Gettysburg people addressed the problem. They formed a committee and they decided to create a national cemetery, and they wanted to put it on Cemetery Hill. It was approved, and a plan was made to dedicate the cemetery on the 19th of November, 1863. And to highlight the thing, they decided to invite to Gettysburg the most influential, famous orator in all of America, Edward Everett of Massachusetts, former president of Harvard and governor of the state. And then, as an afterthought, they decided it would be nice to have a few appropriate remarks from the President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln's staff at the White House wanted him to come to Gettysburg by train the morning of the event. But Lincoln said no, he'd go the day before on the 18th. He wanted to be sure he got here. The rails were going to be busy with special trains going to Gettysburg. This was a big event. Why was Lincoln so eager to be here? He didn't want to miss it because he had some things he wanted to say to the country. The war was not going well. Yes, there had been a victory of sorts at Gettysburg, but Lee's army had not been destroyed. Lee was back in Virginia on the loose. Lincoln knew the war would go into the next year. There was so much fighting and bloodshed ahead. There were some things he wanted to say. So he got here at 5 o'clock on the afternoon before the event. He was met here by David Wills, the Gettysburg lawyer, who was the moving force behind the cemetery, and Wells escorted him just up the street to the square where Wills's house stood, where Lincoln would spend the night. The day of the great event, Lincoln came in a procession from the Wills house out to the cemetery to the speaking platform, which was located at the top of the hill up beyond that fence. The cemetery was still under construction. There were open graves and they were keeping the crowds out. And what a crowd there was, probably 20,000 people, including many men who had fought here. Edward Everett spoke first, and he spoke for 2 hours as he was expected to do, and he gave a magnificent report on what the battle had been all about and he was careful to mention Stannard's Vermonters. A hush came over the crowd after the long applause for Everett, and then Lincoln walked to the speaker's stand with a few small papers in his hand. He looked out across the valley where all of this had happened, and he began to speak. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we do this, but in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. And we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people and for the people, shall not perish from the earth. The applause for Lincoln went on and on. And then the 20,000 people went away, but really they have never stopped coming to Gettysburg, which has become the shrine of the American Civil War.
Our next story this afternoon is about economic development and food safety. The two topics aren't usually talked about in the same sentence, but as Keith Silva tells us, this is a case of good business news for Vermont.
The line is humming at Vermont Bottling Company.
We manufacture upwards of 50,000 bottles a week, and we'll do that almost every single week of the year.
Vermont Bottling Company manufactures a range of beverage products, from cocktail mixes to ready-to-drink teas. With 22 employees, Vice President of Operations Andrew Bessie says the 6-year-old Williston-based business is in a growth mode.
This is a busy place. It's very common to come in and have a couple of full 18-wheel tractor trailers on the docks, a couple people work in the warehouse, loading, unloading, building orders for customers and clients, as well as a full production staff and sanitation staff as well.
The business's success has brought an increase in production and new clients.
We were being approached by a large new set of clients for development work, and clients who wanted us to run some very unique recipes and beverage mixes. In order to manufacture these recipes and things safely, we like to have every single recipe brought to us evaluated by what's called a competent processing authority. This is somebody who has education and experience with how recipes are put together in a food-safe manner. And typically we were sending people to an outside institution for this evaluation, which takes time and money for our clients. So we reached out to the University of Vermont to see if somebody had that experience and was available to evaluate these recipes, and that's when we were introduced to Dr. Omar.
There are a lot of misconceptions about food, okay? And I try to work out with the science and, evidence-based science to support food safety, okay?
In his role as a processing authority, Omar Yarsabal works with Bessie on food safety training for employees, makes sure Vermont Bottling Company is meeting food safety regulations, and assures the proper documentation is in place for federal inspectors.
It's coming along really good, Omar. We've got all of our process letters all lined up.
It's safe to say Bessie is obsessed with food safety, and he better be.
Food safety isn't just important, it's everything. We take food safety here extraordinarily seriously. It's our first thought in their day, it's our last thought in their day, and it's constantly on our mind every minute of every day that we're producing people's foods here. Without food safety, we do not have a viable business at all here.
Yarsabal's role as a processing authority is essential to Vermont Bottling Company, but it's the relationship he and Bessie have built that goes beyond the work itself.
It is great working with Andrew because he listens. Sometimes you have to understand that there are a lot of limitations to do things in an ideal world. It comes from, monetary limitations, equipment limitations, facilities, personnel. So he's willing to work out different alternatives and discuss them. I always find also that I have always found that the personnel working here are very serious, are dedicated, and they care about it.
Without access to expertise such as Dr. Omar, certain circumstances arise within a food manufacturing facility. Whereas we have generalized training, we don't have very deep and very exact specialized training in a food science setting or specific knowledge, or within the range of regulations that we must meet with the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA. Dr. Omar brings a very deep understanding of the rules, the regulations, and the fundamental science of what contributes to the food safety in an environment like this.
By working with Yarsabal, Bessie ensures the food safety side of his business is secure and up to code, which in turn has a strong influence on the bottom line.
I would conservatively say that the impact is in tens of thousands of dollars a year to our business by either being able to continue producing or avoidance of consultation fees, or simply the delays of having to send things out to be evaluated and have an answer come back in a timely amount of fashion. It allows us to continue to grow our business. It allows us to continue to attract new clients, new business, to employ more Vermonters. It allows us to look at upgrading our facilities. It allows us to look at bringing in new equipment. If we were forced to spend money on these other things, or we had more downtime because we had to evaluate a situation, we wouldn't be able to progress as far as we had in our business.
As a land-grant university, UVM is charged with providing the people of Vermont with the knowledge base and unbiased research from its faculty and staff. This service is what matters most to Yarsabal.
At the end of the day, I'm not a person paid by the company. So I want them to develop skills to, go further and have less attachment to somebody like me. And therefore it becomes more like very unique kind of questions, like, oh, this is something new we haven't faced. Can you help? Really, it's a networking issue.
For me, it was logical to reach out to UV Extension, but I had never known the depth and the breadth of knowledge, experience, and services that Extension could offer. This partnership, it has so much potential, not only for Vermont Bottling Company, but also hopefully that Vermont Bottling Company can give something back to the Extension as well. We're open to partnerships, whereas if UVM Extension or Dr. Omar wants to do testing or collect data or experimentation, we can offer those types of things by running hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands units taking data.
To keep the line moving at Vermont Bottling Company requires dedication, collaboration, and a strong connection between Vermonters and UVM. In Williston, I'm Keith Silva with Across the Fence.
The Vermont Bottling Company is certified by the Global Food Safety Initiative, which represents the highest standards in food packaging and quality control. That's our program for today. Thanks for joining us. I'm Judy Simpson. I'll see you again next time on Across the Fence.